everyone. Welcome to the Community Classroom. This is Dr. Tracy McCarthy, psychologist, attorney, and educator. We're going to be talking about the issue of pretexting and social engineering of identity with respect to the current pandemic. There are a few dynamics that are going on where there are healthcare communications coming from individuals who are alluding to a particular identity to create the illusion of a particular identity, and it really amounts to identity appropriation. We've talked about this dynamic before with respect to reparations and some other dynamics that were going on a couple of years ago, and so we're going to revisit this because this is coming up again, and this is significant with respect to the current pandemic and communications around healthcare. And so when you are talking about social engineering and this idea of pretexting, in other words, a pretext, pretending, when you have this dynamic going on with respect to African Americans, you have individuals for some reason creating this illusion that they are African American or these descendants of American chattel slavery in order to appropriate that identity and then give themselves voice, or give themselves access, or give themselves legitimacy. In this particular case, this is really problematic because in terms of cultural competence, that's not really the way that you exercise cultural competence in clinical situations. And so you don't take on the identity of your patient in order to identify with your patient. But that's exactly what's going on. And you see this in a number of social movements where people are giving themselves voice by identifying with particular groups of people. You see that with BLM, you see it with this new group called BIPOC, and this is not an appropriate way to exercise cultural competence or to give people appropriate voice. People should be using the voice that is authentically theirs. And so whatever a person's ethnic group is, that's what they should be identifying as. And so a dynamic that's going on is cultural competence is being implicated. And so you have individuals who are being identified as being in a particular ethnic group when they are probably not a member of that particular ethnic group. And this is all based upon very superficial phenotype dynamics. And so those individuals are being used to communicate messages to particular groups of people. In this case, African American people, or people who are identified as African American. And these individuals are presenting as having a certain legitimacy with respect to these groups of people. They are presenting as having a particular access based upon this identity that is not necessarily their identity, and that identity is descendant of American chattel slavery. And so when someone takes on this identity, or they give the illusion of this identity, what happens is they get access, they get voice, and they get legitimacy with respect to the target population and then those who are considered onlookers. With respect to cultural competence, however, this is not what is considered standard cultural competence with respect to healthcare. And in many ways, it can be understood as being disrespectful to the particular cultural group that is in receipt of the communication or the interaction. Now, in the news reporting, the clinician is identified as a Black doctor with a message for the African American community. And so there's some distinction being drawn there, even though there is the presentation of the person as either an African American or an African American by proxy. And so this individual's communication revolves around the urging of a particular healthcare behavior with respect to the current pandemic, and the person talks in almost begging language, please, please participate in the particular medical procedure. And again, the person is being presented as occupying that particular cultural identity with respect to African Americans. It's done by illusion and illusion. And what's noteworthy in this particular commentary from this particular clinician is the mentioning of Tuskegee. And so the individual mentions Tuskegee and then attempts to disabuse anyone of the thought of connecting the current situation with Tuskegee. That's something that's noteworthy there, because again, this person is attempting to don the identity of expert with respect to the experiences of what would be considered African Americans. Now, what's also noteworthy is that the individual distinguishes between African Americans and blacks. This is atypical. However, you see African Americans, blacks distinguished here. And again, it's not clear what that distinguishing is all about, but that is definitely something that needs to be explored. Now, in the news reporting, what is noted is this is, again, a message to the African American community from a black doctor without any understanding of why that distinction is there, why it isn't a message to the African American community from an African American doctor, or to the black community from a black doctor. It's very specifically from a black doctor, whatever that means, to the African American community, whatever that means. And then you see that the individual communicating this message about healthcare behavior is identified as a neurological surgery resident coming out of Indiana. Now, this individual has an identity that ties them with Nigeria, and specifically with Igbo. This, of course, is noteworthy based upon prior conversations that we've had related to these identity issues with respect to African Americans and individuals who are Igbo. It is also noteworthy that a number of people who identify as African American also identify as having Igbo genetics. And this is important because we've also talked about the likely heritage of the Igbo people and the European roots or European connections with respect to Igbo identity. Now, although this individual is taking on this role of expert in terms of African American healthcare and behavior, it is noted that the individual's surname does come out of Nigeria. This surname is most prevalent in Nigeria. The density is highest in Nigeria. In other words, that's where the block is hot. And you can visually see this here, that this is where this name is rooted. And in terms of ethnicity, this is the connection for that particular name, not African American. Now, in a time such as this is very important, these issues of ethnicity, these issues of genetics, because there are some different genetic dynamics going on with respect to this current pandemic that really need to be explored and really need to be explained, because you have a number of people in particular places around the world who are variously impacted by this situation, and there should be some understanding about why that is taking place. You have a place such as the United States, which has, I would argue, the best health care in the world. However, you have individuals who are suffering the most for some strange reason right here in the United States, and those places where they have less health care in terms of availability, in terms of resources, in terms of supplies, in terms of technology, those individuals are not impacted to the same degree. And so again, we've talked about these discrepancies, genetic discrepancies in terms of disease and disease outcomes with respect to specifically those who were considered descendants of the transatlantic slave trade and those who are occupying the spaces where these individuals purportedly came from. And so there are these distinctions, and these distinctions are important. With respect to Igbo identity, we've talked about this before. There is definitely a connection between Igbo identity and Europe. There is definitely a connection between Igbo identity and Iberia, Iberia, Caucasian, European identity. There is that connection there. And so it's very important to keep this in mind when we are talking about this idea of cultural competence, because even though you have skin color that is the same, it doesn't mean that the people are the same. And so that needs to be kept in mind, because with this cultural competence dynamic going on, you have individuals who are assuming that people can be the experts and the voices for people when they do not belong to that particular people group. It would be the same as if someone who's African American were to go over to Igbo land and start taking on the identity of an Igbo and then start asserting that they know what's best for the Igbo people. It would be highly inappropriate, and it's highly inappropriate in this instance. However, when you are in a situation where race has been identified along phenotype lines, things can get more blurred in the United States when that is what is going on. And so sometimes people are taking advantage of that particular nuance that goes on in America, but it is highly inappropriate in terms of clinical work and in terms of cultural competence. And as clinicians, we know that. We know that that is not something that we should be doing. I should not be taking on the identity of another group of people simply because we share skin color. And so the same thing goes for other colleagues, regardless of what clinical field they might be in. They should not be taking on these identities in order to communicate a message or in order to assert a certain expertise or legitimacy with respect to that particular community. And as we've discussed before, there is that relationship of Eber and Iber and Iver to Igbo. The name is basically the same name, and these names are related to Austria. This is related to the Celtic people. This is related also to the Holy Roman Empire in many ways. And so it's important to keep this in mind. A number of people want to use culture in order to replace genetics, but genetics are genetics and culture is culture. And so just because a particular genetic group or racial group, family group takes on a particular culture, that does not change who they are in terms of ancestry. And so that needs to be kept in mind when we're talking about the Igbo people are a particular people. And the people who are in the United States under the identity of African American, they are also a particular people. What that particular status is, however, is not always completely clear. And so it's murky. We've talked about how murky it is. We've talked about those who have a shared phenotype might be contributing to making things murky. However, we do need to keep in mind that you do have these cultural distinctions and you do have these genetic distinctions, and it's not the best idea to take on the identity of one group in order to assert legitimacy or expertise with respect to the history or the culture or the reality of that particular group, regardless of whether one is trying to be helpful in terms of clinical practice. Now, with respect to Igbo people, as we've talked about before, and also those who are identified as African American, you have a number of identities that are associated with these different groups of people. However, there is enough cultural distinction that individuals need to respect those cultural distinctions and not take on those identities in order to communicate a message or in order to assert a legitimacy or an expertise with respect to someone's cultural experience. And that is the case whether you're talking about clinical work or you're talking about any other type of work. And I also want to point something out. There are enough cultural groups around the world that have their own specific issues with respect to the pandemic. And one of the things that is noted is that there's a totally different dynamic going on with respect to the current medical procedure based upon an ethnic group. And so if you just do a little search to see what's going on in terms of the Igbo and this particular situation, you will see that very little comes up. You also see that there are some different dynamics going on in Nigeria with respect to this situation. And so if an individual has a Nigerian background, and there is a need to communicate a healthcare message about behavior, that it might be best to direct that in terms of that expertise to the cultural group that one belongs to. And we'll see exactly why. So in the United States, where you have all of these mandates going on and you have all of this legal authority being asserted, what you have going on in Nigeria is the opposite. And so Nigeria has indicated that in terms of the law, there is no legislation or regulation that allows Nigeria to mandate these particular procedures. And so they are asserting that you can't just do this by oral proclamation, even though this has been done in a couple of communities. And so you have some dynamics that are going on over in Nigeria with respect to Igbo people very specifically. And so if a person is Igbo, it probably would be better in terms of asserting authority, in terms of ethnic authority, to make those communications, those cultural competence communications, to the group in which one actually belongs. And so while the individual clinician is asserting that there is this sense of urgency with respect to African Americans, it's noted very recently that only about 2% of individuals in Nigeria have participated in the particular medical procedure related to the pandemic. And so that's a far cry lower than what is the case among African Americans. And so it would seem that with respect to expertise and with respect to this sense of urgency, that the individual clinician with a tie to Igbo land would direct their attention to the medical needs with respect to the pandemic to that particular group of people. And so if there's a communication that needs to be made about the urgency of now, that communication should probably be directed to the people who have less of an uptake of this particular medical procedure versus a group of people who have far exceeded this. And this is just a reminder about being careful about making these assertions about cultural competence or about appropriating identity or alluding to an identity. You have different healthcare dynamics going on, different genetics going on with respect to those who are on the west coast of Africa and those who are in the Americas. And so what it looks like based upon what's going on in Africa and what's going on in the Americas is that what's called a pandemic is highly endemic, and it is endemic to America, the United States of America, and endemic to particular groups in America. That is something that needs to be studied. We need to understand better why individuals in the United States, in the Americas, in the quote unquote African American community, why they are having this very unique experience of this pandemic in contrast to the rest of the entire world. And so if an individual wanted to take on this identity of expertise, then this might be something that they might want to pursue a little bit more versus simply asserting an authority and a legitimacy and a voice that may not be theirs to assert. And so this is research going way back 1968. And even then, there was this issue of trying to understand why there was this difference in terms of immune functioning between those in the Americas and those on the west coast of Africa, if these were in fact the same people. And again, this is not something that should be forgotten. This is something that should be remembered. And at a time such as this, when you are seeing this discrepancy yet again, this is definitely something that needs to be explored, particularly when you have individuals who are asserting expertise that are coming from a situation where this is not their cultural or genetic experience. And so while this clinician feels an urgency to communicate to African Americans about this particular medical procedure, what would be most appropriate in terms of cultural competence would be to communicate whatever message the person has when a person is assuming this cultural competence and assuming this legitimacy and giving self-voice. This communication really should be geared towards Nigerians and also specifically Nigerian Igbo. And so those are the individuals that the person should be communicating with when giving the message, please go ahead and get this vaccine. That is who the individual should be communicating that to, Nigerian Igbo. Now, if someone wants to do some cross-cultural research, what would be helpful would probably be looking at why individuals understood as African American are having a homogeneous experience of this pandemic when those individuals are in fact very heterogeneous in terms of their genetics, in terms of their immunological functioning, in terms of their cultural dynamics. So you have all of this heterogeneity in terms of those backgrounds, but you have homogeneity in terms of what is understood as their experience in this pandemic. And what's also noteworthy is that they are collectively having a very different experience of this pandemic in contrast to all other people around the world. And so that is definitely something that needs to be given some attention and some understanding, because that's very confusing and very unclear, but that's definitely something that should be researched. You know, exactly how is that taking place, particularly since there is such a campaign directed toward this particular group. Some of that energy could be directed towards understanding exactly what's going on. How are they having a different experience in contrast to West Africa, for instance, or Africa, period, or some of the islands? How is that the case? And why is there this global obsession with those individuals who are understood as African American? It is a global obsession, and it is a noteworthy global obsession, particularly given the heterogeneity of the people under that umbrella. Why is that focus there? And can that focus be used to get a better understanding of the health of the individuals and what might be in their best interest in terms of health dynamics? Remember, knowledge is power. Take care. See you soon.